Is that on? Okay, there, I'm learning. You are all such good students. You're in your seats on time. Is this how they all used to be?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Beth Hinchliffe, a lifelong Wellesley resident and a proud Wellesley High alum. Go Raiders! We're excited to have all of you here in person and on Zoom. Welcome to Roots and Wings, Wellesley High School's legacy of nurturing creativity. Wellesley has a remarkable literary legacy that two of the best-known women poets of the last century called this town home. Catherine Lee Bates and Sylvia Plath grew up here, graduated from Wellesley High, then achieved international renown. Catherine, who lived in Wellesley until her death, of course, wrote America the Beautiful, which she called her hymn to America, and most recently, which Ray Charles turned into this country's anthem of hope in the days after 9/11. And the power and subjects and brilliance of Sylvia's poetry exploded across the world. New Yorker poetry critic and, coincidentally, Wellesley resident, Dan Chasen wrote, "Plath's genius soars above all but a small handful of poets." And she wrote several dozen of the most extraordinary poems in the English language. And he said, her book, Ariel, is one of the greatest books of American literature. And both women throughout their lives paid tribute to the inspiration and support they received from Wellesley High School. But what's really extraordinary about Wellesley High is that this small town produced not only these two worldwide legends. For generations now, the commitment and mission of our English teachers to nurturing, whoops, sorry, who I'm going to wipe out one by one until we're left with only math teachers and Jim Barr will stand up. She moved since I last checked that out.
Yes, I did.
So for generations, the mission of our English teachers to nurturing young students' creativity has produced hundreds of writers who have touched the literary world, and many more who may write for a smaller audience or even just for themselves, but in writing they find their meaning, purpose, and joy. A sampling of Wellesley High writers includes the current U.S. ambassador to China and prolific author, many New York Times bestsellers, including Richard, sustained at #1, but I'm not going to reach him out and pat him, 4 Pulitzer Prize winners, and Adam, who is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award finalist, a Grammy-nominated singer-songwriter, 7 Emmy Award winners for writing, a Saturday Night Live regular cast member and writer, 2 presidential speechwriters at the White House, 1 for each party, and the co-founder of Twitter and book author. So that's how Roots and Wings was born, to celebrate all Wellesley High writers and the legacy of the school and the teachers who have inspired, challenged, and believed in them. The project begins tonight with this panel and will continue on a permanent, ongoing, updated website under the Wellesley Library site. The address is in your programs. The Roots and Wings website includes the names and biographies of Wellesley High writers, 132 so far, and please let us know any updates, new names, new publications. It also gives detailed information about tonight's panelists, special articles written for the site about Catherine Lee Bates, Sylvia Plath, and Wilbury Crockett's relationships with Wellesley, and announcements of future events. And Roots and Wings as a project inspires us to do more than just celebrate the past and the present. The third part of this project is, as a community, to come together to ensure that we in our schools will continue to value this rare tradition and to urgently commit to keeping it a priority in our future. This outstanding panel, which has traveled from as far away as Colorado to be with us tonight, is going to talk about how Wellesley High developed this literary legacy. But, spoiler alert, I think almost everyone here tonight already knows the answer. Wilbury Crockett, a teacher of fierce intellect and rock-solid integrity who also became our moral North Star. Mr. Crockett first entered Wellesley High almost 80 years ago, taught English here until 1980, 30 years as department chair. Just think of that, 80 years ago, and he's been gone from the school for over 40 years, and yet we still talk about him with passion and pride and immediacy. If you were a Crocketeer, you were a Crocketeer for life. So to start out tonight, we have a special guest in the audience who is our direct living link to the man to whom this project is dedicated. Would Mr. Crockett's daughter, Debbie, please stand? I was blessed, and I don't use that word lightly, with my Wellesley High English teachers who shaped my writing and my life. It all started on my first day of high school. Way back then, it was only 3 years, when I met my 10th grade English teacher, the irrepressible sprite who enchantingly, you gave away who this is, who enchantingly embraced literature, her students, our writing, and me with her contagious joy. Jeanie Eaton Goddard, on behalf of your 38 years of students, thank you for believing in us and therefore showing us how to believe in ourselves. More on you later. I also had the brilliant Susan Alexander, who immersed us in the thrilling challenge of world literature. The depth and resonance of the literary analysis she taught us quite honestly made her classes more powerful than the ones I took as an English major in college. And of course, my third teacher. My roots grew deep in the privilege of being a Crocketeer. Some thank yous before we start. First, to our creative and contagiously imaginative Wellesley Library Director, Jamie Jurgensen, for believing in the vision of this project. Next, deepest gratitude to the indefatigable and utterly remarkable Assistant Library Director, Kara Rothman, for her enthusiastic support, professionalism, patience, and exceptional hard work. Also, appreciation to the Friends of the Wellesley Free Library and President Barbara Marks, who would do anything for us. The Friends' generous support made this evening possible. And even more importantly, perhaps, they were the ones who made the unbelievably delicious homemade goodies that line the walls. Thanks to Wellesley Books for making these books available tonight, and for always being such a supportive and exciting resource in town. Thanks to Wellesley Media, which is recording tonight's event. Check our website for a cable broadcast schedule and a link. And thanks to Wellesley Weston Magazine and publisher Beth Furman. To learn more about Roots and Wings and Wellesley High writers, read the upcoming Spring 2023 issue. Mr. Crockett was mentor and muse not only to generations of students, but also of teachers. The teachers he hired, loved, and inspired in his mold directly continued his legacy for another 30 years, and those teachers guided the ones who continue it today. Their descendants will carry it on into the future. So we are still living in Mr. Crockett's world. And so tonight, we honor all the Wellesley High teachers, past and present. Please stand or wave when I call your name, and stay standing or waving. Led by Wellesley High principal and former English teacher, Jamie Chisholm. Former English department chairs Brooks Goddard, Amy Anderson, and Ronna Frick, and our beloved Wellesley High teachers, Jeanie Goddard, Ronnie Breatholtz, Eva Adler, Marissa McCoy, Don McAleer, and Jim Barr. Our special guest, School Superintendent David Lucier. Any teacher of any subject that I missed, I'm sorry I didn't see you, so please stand now, and then together let's all salute our former and current Wellesley High teachers. What's the name of the man who just stood up?
Bob Dankner.
Bob Dankner?
Dankner. He's a math teacher from the junior high.
Thank you. Notice Bob Bankner stood up, so want to make sure he's mentioned too. And now, the people who have brought us here tonight, please stand, all Wellesley High writers. If you have a red star, stand. The deeply meaningful photo behind me embodies the central theme of Roots and Wings. Taken in 1970, it shows the deep and bonded relationship between teacher, here Mr. Crockett, and student, here Linda Barnes, who went on to become a professor and writer, as this photo has gone on to become iconic and symbolic. Linda is here tonight and will say a few words about their relationship and the photo. Linda?
Good evening. I want to thank very much Beth Hinchliffe, and I think her as Jeanie Eden, because she married after I left Wellesley High, Jeanie and Goddard, for inviting me. And as Beth has said, Jeanie and Susan Alexander and Mr. Crockett were my teachers as well.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a trifecta. We're focusing on one person tonight, but all three. Is this on? Oh. Is it on now? It is on now. Okay. I'm so used to projecting in the classroom that I don't stop to think about needing a mic. Could you hear what I said so far? Okay. All right. I was thinking as I walked in here that this library is also a part of my history because my family moved to Wellesley when I was, I think about 3. And so my mother brought me to this library, to the children's section, and I don't know if any of you remember Florence Sturgis, who was the librarian for the children's section at that time. But if I think about the people in my life who inspired me to read and to think about what I read, in some ways, in Wellesley, it starts with Florence Sturgis and then continued through the different teachers I had. So I want to just acknowledge her part in all of this and her part in this library because she created a magical children's section. In fact, at one point, one summer, she hired me to work in the children's section, and I was a terrible employee because I kept wanting to sneak off and read. So, as opposed to shelving books, or I'd disappear with a truck of books and then spend time reading them. So that's an outing of myself in terms of being a library employee. This picture, I remember the day that we took it. Brooks was asking who the photographer was, and we were wondering whether it might have been Mac Lee, which is a possibility. That part I don't remember. I do remember our sort of meandering around the high school looking for a location that wasn't going to be, a brick wall. And this was out on the aqueduct that runs sort of through the high school. And so I don't know if that bench is still there, but we picked that and sat down, and I remember thinking, this is a little odd that we're sitting out in the middle of the snow looking at a book. So the fact that it became somewhat iconic is is, in the one hand, sort of odd. At the same time, what I think it also suggests to me is that there is no place that is not a good place to sit down and talk about a book with someone you care about. And it was just a pause. I think it captures a pause in which that was happening. And so for me, that's part of what matters about it. I remember that at the time I was studying with Mr. Crockett, it was a time, as many of you remember, of tremendous turmoil. It was the late 60s. And so at that point, my crew used to hang out in what was at that time known as the Payne Street parking lot. And we all felt that was a really apt name. You know, we were all out there on Payne Street. And many of the people in that group looked for ways to anesthetize that pain. I lost friends at that time to overdoses. It was the era of Vietnam and of Vietnam protests on the Wellesley College campus. And so in that time, Mr. Crockett sort of maintained this kind of timeless calm. You know, he didn't change how he dressed, he didn't change how he spoke, he just was there. And I think of him in some ways of providing a kind of haven through literature, so a haven from everything that was happening, but also a kind of window onto what was happening through literature. You know, in some ways, what he gave us was the equivalent, I later realized, of a college seminar, because he didn't dumb anything down. I was thinking as I was on my way here about what life might have been like if I had not known Mr. Crockett, if he had not played a part in my life. In my senior year, I went on to do a directed study with Kathy Stone, Liz Healy, and Amy Richardson with Susan Alexander. We hadn't been entirely happy with our senior English teacher, and we went to her. I don't know that I would have had the courage to do that had Mr. Crockett not sort of inspired us to think that we could take that sort of independent stand with literature. And so we met weekly, and we made up our own reading list and sort of carried that out. But I think that my relationship with Susan Alexander was shaped in many ways by the foundation laid by Wilbury Crockett. I don't know if I would have gone on to Smith. I don't know whether I would have at Smith decided, at least to start out, majoring in comparative literature. That shifted over time to American studies because of everything that was happening politically, and I felt a need to understand all of that. And eventually, over time, that morphed into anthropology, but set in the United States. So the sort of focusing on different worlds, different ways of seeing the world. I see a continuity that started with literature, moved into sort of understanding the many dimensions of American culture and its complexities and pluralisms, and then translating into anthropology of literally being situated within those other worlds. I see them as profoundly connected. So I don't know whether I would have taken that path had I not studied with him. You know, because for him, literature was a way of engaging in other worlds and other worldviews. So, you know, I remember at one point as I was undertaking sort of yet another field of study, my stepfather, whom some of you may remember, Forrest Maddox, he was an orthopedic surgeon at Newton Wellesley. Some of you may remember him. But his saying to my mother, "Oh, what is she going off to do now?" And what I remember thinking was that some people have a career trajectory as he had, because from childhood he had been clear he wanted to be a surgeon, and then went on and did that, that for some of us the straight line was a zigzag. But in any case, what I really want to close in saying is that some teachers are turning points. They really are, and some of that only becomes clear much later, and the particulars don't become clear until later. And I think of Wilbury Crockett as one of my key turning points. I want to apologize. I have a 5-month-old puppy in the car, and I'm driving back to New Hampshire, and if I'm lucky when I get out there, she won't have demolished the car and maybe eaten it. So I want to apologize. I'm not leaving by first choice, but because of a puppy. But anyway, thank you so much.
Can you come for a picture?
Pardon me?
Come up here. Oh.
I kept this hair until the age of 45, then had cancer and kept that haircut.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda. Give our love to the puppy. The impassioned, exceptionally talented, and fiercely dedicated Lita Eisenberg manages to bring together all the themes celebrated here tonight. She grew up in Wellesley, graduated from Wellesley High, became an English teacher, has always been a writer, is a Wellesley parent, and is currently chair of the Wellesley School Committee. From her unique perspective, she will offer a welcome. Nita?
Thank you, Beth, and thank you all for being here. What an honor to be asked to speak to you. I have to admit that I didn't recognize that it was going to be my turn to talk based on Beth's superlative introduction. But I'm so honored to be here among the heroes who introduced me to the dual higher callings of literature and of teaching, and among 4 writers, and it seems like many others, who have taken those same lessons and brought them to life in books of their own. I'm Lita Eisenberg, and as Jeanie put it to me recently, I am a wearer of many hats. School committee chair, sometimes writer with a book project that, if it were a human, would be old enough to attend Wellesley High School, parent, and forever English teacher is how I like to think of myself. I'm really here tonight, though, to celebrate these 4 brilliant authors and the amazing teachers who made Wellesley High School into a literary home for them all, and for many others. There was a common refrain in my days at Wellesley High School that Wellesley was a bubble. This was meant as a pejorative, as an awareness of the privilege many of us enjoyed, and the unreality of it all, a sense of disconnect from the real world. And yes, in some ways it was a bubble, but like all bubbles, it was translucent, for our teachers brought the light in and empowered us to see out. For me, those teachers were Brooks, Jeanie, and Rana, but for others it was Dennis, Marty, Eva, and even some people outside of the English department, like Jerry Murphy or Mary Lynn. A dear family friend has just begun her journey as a freshman at Wellesley High School. I, of course, regularly ask her about her English class with Mr. Tan. It's not really just English class, she told me this past Saturday night, before detailing the many short stories she's read and ranking them according to how gut-wrenching they are. It's life lessons class. How wonderful to know that when it comes to the Wellesley High English department, so little has changed. In that department, reading, and even more so discussing what we had read, was how we came to understand what it meant to be human, whether it was Hamlet's existential writhing, some students might say whining, Bigger Thomas's dehumanizing alienation and ultimate connection, or Sylvia Plath's vast rage at a world that wanted her to be small. We learned about ourselves, and we developed empathy, an understanding of existences outside of our own, and deepened our thinking about life's essential questions. Is man free? Asked Brooks's mid-year exam my senior year. Use the text we've read this semester. You have 2 hours. Go. Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop likens literature for students to windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. Ways we can see others, see ourselves, understand others, and both change and be changed. When I read Vanessa Martir's description of Brooks coming up to her on the mez at the old Wellesley High School and handing her How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents by Julia Alvarez, I got chills. She felt seen, and she could see. I hope I'm not overstepping when I say that moment made you a writer. And now, today, she creates work that has that same impact on others. What a powerful reminder of the sacred duty of a teacher of literature, Books can be a lifeline. Students who feel they don't fit anywhere can find themselves in books. If reading is how we learn about our world, writing is how we make sense of it all. Many among us will remember the Self paper, an assignment given to seniors shortly before graduation that asks students to look at themselves and their world. When I was a student, it struck me as a gift for us, for students. But once I assigned it and found myself weeping at the beauty and power of so many of my students' essays, I realized that it was as much a gift to the teacher and whoever else was given the privilege of reading it. In a way, that same task of taking stock of an inner world and making sense of the outer one has been undertaken so profoundly and so differently by each of the writers who join us tonight. And we, their readers, have the chance to embrace and understand the meaning they each have made. I'm reminded of a passage from Native Son by Richard Wright, when Bigger understands his humanity and how it connects him to everyone. If he reached out with his hands, and if his hands were electric wires, and if his heart were a battery giving life and fire to those hands, and if he reached out with his hands and touched other people, reached out through these stone walls and felt other hands connected with other hearts, if he did that, would there be a reply, a shock? Yes, let us resoundingly reply. Let us feel these connections that our teachers and our authors have been brave and generous and gifted enough to share with us. And let those connections bind us to others, remind us of our common humanity and purpose. Thank you.
Thanks, Lita. Jeanie. Glorious Jeanie. One-of-a-kind Jeanie. Jeanie of the tender heart and joyous spirit. It was my joy to be in your classroom. And all these uncountable decades later, it has been my joy to work with you on Roots and Wings. But I probably owe you an apology, because even though you said you were proud when I worked in the White House as speechwriter to the president, I know that privately you were rending your garments in utter despair, wondering where you had gone wrong because I worked for a Republican. No, not that one. Jeanie came to us in 1967 with an AB in English and a BS in education from Simmons College, with her master's in English from the Breadloaf School of English at Middlebury. She spent her entire career of 38 years at Wellesley High, where she taught sophomore and senior English classes, Shakespeare, and for many years taught humanities with her great friend Jerry Murphy. Also taught me driving. And Jeanie always taught us joy. Jeanie? Yeah.
All right. Oh, gosh. My heart is aflutter here to be with my beloved Beth, whose prodigious and meticulous efforts to bring this project to fruition really rivals any military campaign. She could have done D-Day. I would have passed it over to her. She is a marvel, and I knew that she would be the minute I met her when she was 15 in my sophomore English class. And to be with these four glorious students, writers, adults, all of which I had the great pleasure to have in my class. Dick's passion for activism and politics and the natural world, he never, ever failed to fight injustice, old Dick. Adam would swoop through the halls in his cloak. Do you remember that cloak? Charming us with his charisma and his star turns on stage. Nina, reading her profound papers always nearly brought me to tears, and her dazzling poetry just was, Rana, just amazing. And our two young, and Vanessa, oh my God, her fire and her bracing honesty and courage all signaled early the greatness and the genius of these four people. Our two young Wellesley High poets, Derek and Maya, whom you will hear from later, promise a noble continuation of writing glories. How lucky, lucky, lucky we all are to have them. And I want first to pay tribute to every elementary, junior high, middle school, and high school teacher who has ever taught in Wellesley. So many of the writers in this evolving database were inspired by teachers from every grade and every discipline. It's not just, we like to think we are the center of the world, the English department, but it's unfortunately not true. And there are others who have done magnificent things, and there are representatives here. And so it is with great humility that Brooksy and I represent you on this panel. And just to see my colleagues and dear friends out there, and parents and students is a thrill. When I first came to Wellesley High School, I was a student teacher in the fall of 1965. And even then, I sensed that this school, this English department, these students were different. Was it the Wellesley water? Was it the lack of a hierarchy in the school system? Where on earth did they find this feistiness, this freedom to express themselves? Certainly, it had to have something to do with Wilbury Crockett's inspired teaching and his unfailing, sometimes we thought benighted, belief in his department. Debbie, dear Debbie, surely we could not have deserved such praise and steadfastness. I used to talk to Ronnie, I'd read my evaluation, I said, who is this he's writing about? He just believed in us, made us feel so just accepted and exhilarated, and it helped us believe in our students as well. And we've all felt free to teach and to choose curriculum and to learn in this truly dynamic school environment. So whatever the alchemy was, Wellesley High students possess, in my view, a unique desire to initiate, a confidence to engage, a willingness to risk. They challenged us, and that challenge made us better teachers. I remember vividly beginning my teaching of Native Son, Richard Wright's wonderful novel, and just as the first class was beginning, a group of Metco students filed into my room and stood in the back of the classroom. Well, I almost threw up, actually. I was so nervous and terrified, but I was also exhilarated. They came in to make sure it would go well and that I would say, the right things and approach the novel correctly. And they taught me so much just by their presence. Yes, we demanded that our students read and they write, but what they did with assignments and what they achieved at Wellesley High and after graduation was nothing short of magical. When personal tragedy struck in 1972, and a senior girl who happened to live in Catherine Lee Bates's house died of a rare cancer, one of her dear friends wrote the following poem as a tribute to her in the 1972 yearbook. Just like that comes the gray shock, the unbecoming, harsh subterfuge, youngly pale, retreating slowly, seeking still death's ransom for another hour. A day's wasting comes not always as a sunset, but rather like a storm, mist or sand that covers all and the soul suffocates. The cruel night with earth-rot smell seizes us all, soon or not. But how hard it is to face, just like that. How Debbie Elms found those words at age 17 seemed a mystery to me and still does. It must have been that writing was a comfort to her, a weapon against despair, a way to explore and understand. Writing was a central part of every English class, and Mr. Crockett encouraged us to have the students write a lot. Joel Kabatsnik, I know there are only a few people who remember Joel, one of the legends of the 60s and 70s, told me about a series of fluency exercises he once assigned to his seniors. They were to write for 15 minutes every day consecutively for 5 days on the same topic. Something that pleased you. One lad first wrote about a ski trip. Then the next day, he wrote about a trip to Disney World. Then, on the third day, he finally wrote what Joel was hoping for, an authentic description of the first time that he had shaved. There, said Joel, is a personal truth. There is something worth writing about. One of my seniors even used his humanities self-paper, the one Lita mentioned, as a pickup line for young women in college. If he met someone promising at a party, he would say, "Would you like to come up to my room and read my self-paper?" I always thought it was far better than etchings. And Jerry and I would look at each other and say, "Only at Wellesley High." I have countless memories of the anguish and frustration students endured before that elusive epiphany would arrive. One such example was a girl running across our front lawn at 11:55 p.m., just barely meeting the midnight deadline of her sophomore thesis, shouting, "Mrs. Goddard, I shouldn't have procrastinated, but I finally understand tragedy and Eugene O'Neill." Maybe asking students to struggle with difficult writing experiences contributed to their confidence. The fact that most of their analytical papers were primary source forced them to fall back on their own ingenuity and insight, and might just be part of the answer as to how Wellesley High nurtured creativity. A moment when I knew how crucial it was to provide equal challenge to every single student occurred one April vacation. Now, Sandy Joseph knows this story because her children were involved. Brooksy and I were supervising the planting of trees and bulbs to beautify the parking lot. I don't know what we were thinking, but 4 boys from completely different English classes somehow discovered that they were all doing Arthur Miller for their sophomore paper due in early May. Suddenly, they began to weigh in on Death of a Salesman, All My Sons, The Crucible, as if they were literary critics. Instant bonding through literature. One of my favorite pieces of student writing that is an example of the generous creative spirit is a poem by a student who knew how much I loved the Red Sox. He and a friend had taken me to Fenway to celebrate my upcoming retirement from full-time teaching. They were not sports fans, had never been to Fenway, knew nothing about baseball. Yet when I taught them how to score, they pronounced it delightfully arcane. 2 years later, on the morning after, and I'm sorry, Jeanie, to have to do this, after the Red Sox had beaten the evil Yankees in Game 7 of the American League Championship in 2004, a year every fan reveres, I received in the mail an email from Austin Werner, who at the time was a sophomore at Yale, a school with an equal number of Yankee and Red Sox fans. Here it is. Midnight, October 21st, 2004. The birds fell silent in the trees. The wind froze and hung in the air. The clock choked, and the second hand hesitated. The earth opened up, and a great roaring battered the skies. How amazing. How perfect. How memorable is that poem? It hangs in our kitchen to this day. So, freedom and challenge, and a way to express the self and the soul, and of course, that Wellesley water, have blessed our Wellesley High students and everything they have written and will write.
That's our Jeanie. It's almost impossible for us today to understand the way that Richard Preston's 1994 nonfiction thriller, The Hut Zone, exploded into the world's stunned consciousness with its sudden and urgent red alert about the previously unheard of threat of Ebola. No one had ever written anything like this before. A scrupulously researched, compulsively and terrifyingly readable book that slapped the world awake to the horrifying reality of threats to all humanity from awakening contagions. The Hut Zone shot to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, stayed there for almost 2 months, and dominated conversation and governments across the planet. The magazine American Scientist cited it as one of the books that shaped science in the 20th century. An asteroid was named after him. He was heralded as the first to introduce the notion of a modern plague. Richard followed The Hut Zone with 8 more bestsellers translated into 35 languages and prestigious international awards. There's a detailed biography of him and of all the panelists on the website. Please read more to understand the powerful influence his words have had on the world. After all, 28 years after The Hut Zone was published, what was at the top of the news last weekend? The United States screening at airports for Ebola. Richard?
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Is my mic on?
Yeah, you can use mine.
Great. How about that? Can you hear me now?
Yeah. We were in high school a year apart, so help him out.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth. Well, I'm really honored and thrilled to be here. This is a delight. And it's especially a delight to see faces of the faculty of Wellesley High School whom I know and taught me. That is absolutely the best. I'm so happy to be here tonight. The asteroid Preston, by the way, just as a note, is on a chaotic orbit near Mars. There's a statistical chance that it could hit the Earth, causing a mass extinction similar to the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. So I hope that doesn't happen. We have at least 100,000 years, so not to worry. So I have, in the course of my education, I had 5 mentors whom I can identify among teachers. And 3 of those are from the Wellesley High School, 1 from college and 1 from graduate school. So the Wellesley High School faculty are the 800-pound gorilla of mentoring, at least for me. And to name them, Jeanie Goddard, the late Jerry Murphy, and Wilbury Crockett. Notably, Brooks is not on my list for the simple and poignant reason that I never took a course from him. Had I done so, I would have had 4 mentors. There's no doubt about that. So my own story begins about 200 yards that way at the Honeywell School, where I was in 1st grade. I was a small, shy kid, and I had difficulty learning how to read. I was behind much of the class. For some reason, I couldn't put together words like see Dick run, see Jane run. But the teacher, Ann McHale, spoke to my mother, and she said, I think you should try him on comic books. And so my mother got me, on the teacher's advice, Superman and Caspar the Ghost. And I never looked back. That's how I started in reading. But as a shy, quiet kid, I often found myself after school, it was an awfully easy thing to just walk from the Honeywell School here to the Wellesley Free Library, where I would immerse myself in the books in the children's section. And I just learned from Beth just a few days ago that the children's librarian there was Vera Crockett, married to Wilbury Crockett. So I suppose she could be described as an invisible mentor. I don't remember her very well, but I do remember the books that she introduced me to. One of them was A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. It's a beautiful, unforgettable book, a book for anybody of any age. And then after I had kind of moved around in the children's section, I began wandering around the Wellesley Free Library of an afternoon. And I found myself gravitating, for some reason, to the basement area, which in those days held the nonfiction books, history, science, biographies, and so on. And I would just pull books off the shelf. It was the luck of the dip. And there was a moment in the basement of the library when I was 11 years old that I can remember with great clarity today. I'd gotten into the books on astronomy, and I was looking at pictures of galaxies. And there were some very good science books in the library. And one of the books was about the birth of the universe. And the author talked about the Big Bang. And then there were images of these beautiful galaxies, these spirals and these ovals and these football shapes, taken by the then world's largest telescope, the great 200-inch Palomar telescope on Palomar Mountain in Southern California. And in among these photographs, there was one of the more important scientific diagrams of the 20th century. It's called the Hubble curve. And what the Hubble curve is the astronomer Edwin Hubble discovered in the 1920s, as he was looking at these galaxies and imaging them, that all the galaxies, the universe itself is expanding like a loaf of bread, and that all the galaxies are flying away gradually and then with increasing speed from one another. And the Hubble curve was this question that Hubble had raised. The question was, will the galaxies, so there was a Big Bang in which everything we see in the sky, all these billions of galaxies, originated in an area that was probably about the size of a teacup and then went out from there. Now, will the universe just continue to expand forever? Or will it eventually turn around and then come back and crunch in on itself in a great big crunch? Or will it just kind of putter along? And the real question is space negatively curved, positively curved, or flat? And the Hubble curve, there were 3 different curves in this graph. And I remember looking at this and thinking, that's amazing. It's amazing that we can look at these galaxies and think, they must have life on them. There must be millions of planets out in these galaxies. And to think that a scientist could actually discover where the universe came from and then ask this interesting question, where is the universe going to end up? And then the author of this book said, the great Palomar telescope may well answer this question as to what the fate of the universe is. And I remember thinking at the time, well, medical advances are coming along. I might just live to be 100. Maybe I will live to be 100. And if I do, maybe I'll know the answer to this question if I can live long enough. Maybe the scientists will find out. So anyway, fast forward. And now I've got my PhD in English. I've decided not to become a professor of English. I've decided instead to kind of roll the dice and be a journalist, be a nonfiction writer, be a freelance writer. And I find myself at Palomar Observatory at the feet of the 200-inch Hale telescope with one of the world's great astronomers, Martin Schmidt, who was the discoverer of the quasar phenomenon, black holes in galaxies. And I'm sitting there with my little reporter's notebook, and I'm thinking, this is a dream come true. This is absolute. Who could have believed that I'm this little kid sitting in the library, and now I'm at the Hale telescope, and they're actually trying to answer that very question that I saw in the Hubble curve. I never forgot that. And it in a way, it was a kind of an introduction into the sort of writing that I love to do, which is I love to take readers to places, nonfiction worlds that are real, but nobody has ever dreamed of before. And then introduce them to people who inhabit those worlds and who operate in them with their own dreams and their own explorations of these unknown realms. So the first book about astronomy, and then I went on and I wrote books about the micro-universe of viruses. And, you know, a spacesuit scientist, Colonel Nancy Jacks, who goes into a pressurized laboratory where she works with hot viruses like Ebola. And then, you know, interviewing her and finding out, you know, from her that, you know, that everybody who works in these Ebola labs has a close call. And I asked her about her close call. And she said, well, you know, I had a hole in my spacesuit. And I had been cooking for the kids. And I had been opening a can of beans, and I cut my hand. And now she's in the level 4 lab, and they're dissecting a monkey that has died of Ebola Zaire. And she discovers that there's a hole in her glove. And she can feel monkey blood mushing around inside her spacesuit and on top of the cut. And she tells her commanding officer what's happened. You know, I've had a breach. I've got blood in my suit. And he ordered her to make a crash exit. So you have to go out through an airlock door. And when you're in the airlock in the hot zone at Fort Detrick in Maryland, you have to stand under a chemical shower. And it's controlled by a computer, and you have to stand there for 7 minutes before the door will unlock and you can leave. So she's in this shower for 7 minutes, and she can feel the blood all around her cut. And she knows that the chemicals are not going to reach the hot agent inside her spacesuit. And then she bursts out into the gray zone, level 3. She takes her suit off. And indeed, her glove, she has an inner glove, but it's coated with Ebola blood. And then there's a Band-Aid, and then there's a cut. So, you know, and then, you know, doing focus interviews with Nancy Jacks, finding out from her not just what happened, but what were your emotions at that moment? What was going through your mind? And, you know, and then fact-checking these passages with her again and again, and rewriting little elements and details in real time with her on the phone to get the interior monologue in a nonfiction narrative, so that I can describe as accurately as I can, in a checkable way, what somebody is actually thinking. And what Colonel Nancy Jacks told me was something that I think wouldn't come naturally to a fiction writer's mind. What she said was, well, you know, I was thinking, oh, shit, they're going to put me in the slammer. The slammer is the level 4 hospital where you're behind a locked door and the nurses and doctors are wearing spacesuits and they're trying to save your life. So they're going to lock me up in the slammer. And damn, I forgot to go to the bank today. And the kids are home with a babysitter. Who's going to pay the babysitter if I'm in the slammer with Ebola? Damn. You know, hearing this, you know, I knew that I was hearing something that was completely authentic. It was a mother, but also a scientist. And I love the interface. Essentially, my subject is the relationship of the human species to nature. But what's really important to me, of course, as a writer, is the human beings, not the science. But the science itself is inherently beautiful and wonderful. But in the end, the only thing that matters is us, the human species. So, and then my research has taken me into the tops of redwood trees in California, the redwood forest canopy. So you're up in these trees. They're in excess of 30 stories tall. You can't see the sky. You can't see the ground. You're in a completely unknown and unexplored ecosystem in North America, where the scientists are at the point where they're identifying species, small creatures that don't yet have scientific names. Or writing about the infinite shimmering depths of the number pi, the ratio of the circumference of the circle to its own diameter, and profiling and following these brothers, these two mathematicians, the Chodnovsky brothers, who were living in a seedy apartment in Manhattan, where they were building a supercomputer out of mail order parts and using it to explore pi into billions and billions of digits in order to see if they could detect a pattern or a sequence in the number pi. And if they were able to do so, it would be like getting a glimpse of the face of God. And at the same time, so I'm in the apartment with these men, and their mother is in another little room. She's in bed, and then Gregory's wife is here, and then there were 26 fans running to keep the machine cool. The apartment was generally more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit when I was in there. And then Gregory is down on his knees underneath his supercomputer, and I noticed there was a meat thermometer in the computer, and I said, "What do you have that there for?" And he said, "Well, that's so I can monitor to see whether it's overheating." He said, "When the thermometer reaches pork, that's when I worry." The thing about nonfiction writing is that, unlike in a novel, there's a different deal with the reader, where the arrangement or the contract with the reader is that I'm doing my best to deliver to you a simulacrum of reality, the best I can make it. This is nonfiction. And therefore, you don't have to have a willing suspension of disbelief. You don't have to suspend your disbelief. In fact, believe this. And that adds a layer of power to the writing that is difficult for fiction to achieve, because if you're reading The Hot Zone, you might be thinking, well, this virus, this thing Ebola, it got to a suburb of Washington, so it could come to Wellesley, couldn't it? And that changes your relationship to the text and to the reality that's being described in the text. So at any rate, these mentors at Wellesley, I took the humanities course that Jerry Murphy and Jeanie Goddard were teaching. And this was a cross-disciplinary course that really touched on a lot of things. So we read Plato, we read Henry David Thoreau, we discussed history, we discussed literary art, we discussed government, and we did critical readings of literary texts. We did it all in this one course. And then with Wilbury Crockett, I was terrified of him, actually. I didn't get very good grades. My grades were indifferent in high school. I also had something of a disciplinary problems, lots of them. But anyway, there I am in Mr. Crockett's class. And I remember this man he was intensely gentle, and he had a quiet voice, almost a whisper. And he taught a college-level course, a survey course of English literature, that started with the Hymn of Cadmon, which is 9 lines of Old English poetry. And he introduced us to the poetics of Old English. We read these 9 lines in Old English. We read them in modern translation as well. And it went on from there. So we were learning about things like line breaks and alliteration, all of the mechanics of Old English poetry, and then applying that to what we learned about later poets and poetry. After Wellesley, I had another mentor in college, a novelist named Darcy O'Brien, and then I ended up at Princeton University, where I got a PhD in English. And while I was there, I met and took the writing class of John McPhee, a well-known writer who teaches a well-known writing class at Princeton. He also became a friend and a mentor. And today, I think about the value of an English education. And I know that here in the town of Wellesley, in the last couple of years, there's been kind of a drive to strengthen STEM. And I think that's a really great idea. I think I love science, and I think strengthening STEM is a wonderful thing, but not at the expense of humanities. And that's where I think those people who insist that we must strengthen STEM, they're getting something fundamental wrong here, which is that if you de-resource the humanities, you don't strengthen STEM, you weaken STEM. You weaken it. Why do you weaken it? It's because the humanities strengthen STEM. How does it do that? Well, in recent years, I served as an advisor to the Princeton University Department of English. And every year, with my fellow advisors, we would meet with everybody in the department, including undergraduates. And the last time I was there, I met 2 undergraduates in the Princeton English department who were pre-med. And they realized that actually, if you major in English, it gives you an edge in your application to medical school. Of course, you have to do, you've got to do calculus and you've got to get through organic chemistry. But if you think about this a little bit, preparation in the humanities is a very good preparation if you want to be a good physician. And I know a man, Dr. David Nathan, who was for a while the chief admissions officer at the Harvard Medical School. And he told me that he gave preference to English majors for admission to the Harvard Medical School. Yeah, how about that, huh? The thing about the humanities, including English, but in the larger sense, the humanities, people who are trained in the humanities can deal with intellectually and emotionally problems that do not yield to quantitative analysis. Problems that you can't even break down with quantitative analysis, but somebody with training in English can do this. To give you an example, what about problems like this? The science of genomics has the power to shape DNA. And there are actually keyboards where you can actually type on a keyboard a DNA code, and then the device will actually manufacture that strand of DNA. And then you can put that DNA into any organism. So we are on the cusp of acquiring the power to determine what we are going to be as the human species. We can shape ourselves into whatever we want. But the question is, what do we want the human species to become? And the problems that don't lend themselves to quantitative analysis are problems like this. For example, how do we conduct ourselves toward other human beings? What is the nature of love? And that brings me to a story about Wilbury Crockett. So, he loved poetry, and in particular, I think he liked the poetry of William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet. And at one point, he taught us the Song of the Wandering Angus, which is an early Yeats poem. It was written in 1899, and in that poem, Yeats writes, what he's really doing is he's writing about his longing for Maud Gunn, the woman he loved but could never attain her love. And Mr. Crockett read the last stanza, which I'm going to read to you now. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips and take her hands, and walk among long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. And he read that poem in a low voice that got lower as he approached the end. And then there was silence, and we noticed a tear glistening in his eye. And I think about that, and I think about that moment. And I think, I believe that Mr. Crockett had his wife Vera in mind as he read that poem to us. Mm. But I also think he had his love for his students in mind. His students were everything to him. And I see Wilbury Crockett as not a unique figure, but a symbol who stands for the faculty of the Wellesley High School in its entirety. And I can't even begin to express my gratitude for what you've done for me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Like I'm sure most Wellesley High authors, for the last 20 years, I have followed fiction writer Adam Haslett's career with pride and more than a little envy. He has twice been a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. He was heralded by the Wall Street Journal as one of the country's most talented writers. He received the Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundation fellowships, and he was named New York Magazine's Writer of the Year. You Are Not a Stranger Here, his debut collection of short stories, was followed by the novel Union Atlantic and by his most recent novel, Imagine Me Gone, which the Pulitzer judges described as, quote, the quiet and compassionate saga of a family whose world is shaped by mental illness and the challenges and joys of caring for each other, unquote. I am in awe of his almost unbearably gorgeous and heartbreaking words as he explores how we experience our own pain as well as the pain of others. Adam?
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, and thank you, Beth and Jeanie and Brooks and everyone who helped organize this event. It's quite something to be back here and to see familiar faces after all these years. I'm going to be a little extemporaneous here, so forgive me for the informality. But when I was riding out here this evening with my mother, who was with me, we were also on the phone with my sister, who is a graduate of Wellesley High School 2 years ahead of me, who was also taught by Rana and by Jeanie, and Ronnie as well, actually, Julia, my sister Julia. So I really just want to say a little bit about the influence and what I still carry with me. And it's been touched on, Leda touched on it, Dick touched on it. But Wellesley in the 1980s, when I was here, was a complicated place. And one of the things that Jeanie did in her class was show us a documentary called Webster Groves.
Oh, yes.
And Webster Groves was a documentary made in the 60s, I think, about a suburb of St. Louis, and literally this was a documentary to warn against, in essence, the evils of conformism or conformity. The idea that there would be a kind of, the life had gone to the suburbs, everything had become sameness, and we needed to guard against this kind of blandness, of some sort of cultural blandness, and conformity of social roles. I mean, it was very much about the kind of patriarchal kind of dads talking at the table, and everybody's listening, and that subsequently, my first writing teacher in college was Jonathan Franzen, who had grown up in Webster Groves. So he was actually very much against that documentary. He felt it was unfairly characterized his hometown. But anyway, but in a way, one of the things I remember is my English teachers. And I want to mention Arthur Savage, who was there briefly at Wellesley High School, but was a dear drama teacher to me, who was also teaching literature in a way. I mean, we're doing plays. That these people, first of all, took teenagers' minds seriously, which seems like a challenge, But that there was, as Leda put it, like there may have been a bubble, but they were the light coming in. I thought that was beautifully put, that there was a sense in which, we were teenagers, there was this pressure of, it was Reagan's America, there was a lot of conformity, there was a lot of sense of pressure to be a certain way. I was a gay kid. I had lost my father. I was confused, and I went into classes where that not that exact confusion, but the tumult that lived in people's hearts became beautiful, right? It became something that was available as not just a burden, but a kind of resource, an available space of imagination and rendering and pleasure. I mean, one of the other, my brother was also briefly at Wellesley High, and he would come home and open up a book. I mean, when I was like 13 years old, I'd never heard of the idea of nonfiction. And the distinction hadn't come up. And I said, I'm interested in nonfiction. And so he pulled Nietzsche off the shelf and handed it to me. But, he was also someone who studied at Wellesley High School. And that the pleasure in language, in sentences, in individual paragraphs, that was something that, in many ways, I didn't have a lot of pleasure in my life when I was that age. I was all over the place. And these classes were places where that, as I say, tumult became something I didn't know yet. I was going to shape it into the books that I wrote, that I was going to turn that experience into something dynamic that could be both about the past, it could take place in the present because you were reading it in the present and experiencing it, and be about the future because you were writing something that was going into the world and would have a life in the future. So there was a kind of, again, I didn't know it at the time, except I knew it through the dynamism of the teachers that were teaching the work. Because in the way of all the best teachers, it wasn't just the content of what we were learning, they were demonstrating that you could have a life with books because they were doing it. Because their own enthusiasm and excitement about something that, after all, to it is like, oh God, how many 100 pages of this? I got to read the whole thing. Beginning as a child, when you're handed Crime and Punishment, it feels like a punishment, and so there's like there's a leap of trust you've got to make that this is that kind of attention and rigor is worth the effort, and the teachers I had made that. Demonstrated that. And so I did Eugene O'Neill in my sophomore year, and I think, and the other wonderful thing is the rigor of it, because I think I got a B-. No, it's great. No. But because it was wonderfully rigorous, because basically you said, well, your arguments are decent, but you just frankly haven't read enough of Eugene O'Neill, because of the extent you were supposed to read all of a given author's work. And being dyslexic and a slow reader, I chose a playwright. So I thought it won't take me as long to get through all of these. But there I was reading Eugene O'Neill, who then became someone who I've gone back to so often, and who is a great American tragedian, and whose sort of emotional landscape became its own kind of home over time. And I apologize that I don't know your first name, Mrs. McCoy, because I still call you Mrs. McCoy. But reading All the President's Men in your class, and we don't remember books for their plots, right? We remember them for the atmosphere and the prose and the kind of moodscape and vision that stays with us after years. So I still have a vision of that book from being in that class with you. And another sort of leap forward into writing life, when I was having my first book edited by a woman named Nan Talese, who was a very old, sort of august editor. She had a criticism about a certain line, and I decided, well, in this one I'm going to push back. And I, sort of made my argument about the sentence, And she paused, and then she said, well, you know, it's interesting, because when I was editing Robert Penn Warren's last book, I was like, okay, you win. I'll change it. You know, these experiences are ones that, as an emotional matter, live with me still. And this, I'm not even saying anything about how much Wellesley itself as a town is figured in my own fiction. I mean, there's very little, every book, including a novel I'm about to finish, some of it comes back to some seminal experiences that I had in this town. It's not, you know, as my mother said once, she'd heard a quote from some other writer that once there's a writer in the family, there goes the family. But she has been a steadfast supporter despite that. So in any case, I really am honored to be here. I'm honored to be here with my fellow panelists. It's the fact to me that the very issues, some of which Vanessa wrote about in her amazing piece in the Times, and that later referred to, the very place where those problems existed were a place where I met people who taught me things that led me out of those things. So I just really want to thank you for that. So there we go.
Thank you, Adam.
Changing it to a B+.
I've known Nina Shope since she was a little girl who lived a few houses away, writing stories about runaway pumpkins, witches, and caterpillars. She has a unique bond with the two writers who inspired Roots and Wings. She went to the Catherine Lee Bates School, and at Wellesley High, she won the Sylvia Plath Writing Award. Over the years, I've been proud to see how her fierce intensity has blasted out her own unique place on the literary landscape. Nina's is thrilling writing at the intersection of prose and poetry, a fever dream of passion, trauma, and nightmare. Her first book, Hangings, 3 novellas, was a scorching leap in experimental fiction, a stunning and audacious work of lyricism, style, and astonishing grace. Her hypnotically beautiful and viscerally disturbing new novel, Asylum, the winner of the prestigious Straccione Award for Best Novel, is a triumph by a brilliant and visionary writer. Nina?
Thank you so much, Beth. And I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and especially thank Jeanie and Beth for dreaming up this incredible event, and the library and the Friends of the Library for hosting us. I'm really honored to be part of this panel. So I write experimental fiction, which basically just means that my work doesn't follow the traditional presentation of plot, setting, and character. And when I was in high school, I sort of toggled between poetry and stories. And the high point of my high school career was definitely winning the Sylvia Plath Award in my senior year. I was in awe of the fact that Plath lived in my town and went to the same schools. And I still remember the experience of analyzing her poem Cut and realizing that every single word she selected functioned on multiple levels at once, creating this incredible denseness and richness to her work. And reading her poetry really reaffirmed my desire to write fiction that used the same radical condensation, symbolism, compression, and fragmentation as poetry. My teachers, Mrs. Freilich, Mrs. Goddard, Mrs. Frick, and Mrs. McCoy, helped me learn to trust my voice and also to love literary analysis and difficult writers. I still remember analyzing the dream symbolism and Dostoevsky with Mrs. Frick and submitting an early novel in progress to Mrs. McCoy. And in Mrs. Goddard's class, coincidentally, I also did Eugene O'Neill as my thesis topic. So I don't know if there's some weird connection there. But his wildly poetic language and imagery not only inspired me, but definitely pushed me closer to the sort of writing that I wanted to pursue. And I remember spreading out this huge piece of butcher block paper on Mrs. Goddard's classroom floor and drawing this giant diagram of this thematic cycle that I wanted to write about in my thesis. And Mrs. Goddard didn't scold me for turning in a 42-page paper at the age of 15.
I retired.
And I still have my original thesis with your writing on it. And I was looking over the comments on it, and one of them really cracked me up. Basically, like, for its understatement, she wrote, "Occasionally O'Neill's unbridled emotions drive your style into brief, very brief, flirtations with melodrama," the last line of the conclusion, but that is my only quibble. And here's my very melodramatic last line. "O'Neill's characters are shadows of us all, man, cursed to tread this cycle until the arms of eternity close about him and put him to rest." To which Mrs. Goddard wrote in the margins, "Oh my, a heavy, heavy perspective." So for me, English classes and creative writing helped me express myself despite intense shyness. I kept a note, which I also found in my thesis folder, that Mrs. Goddard wrote me to explain to me that I wasn't going to win the Sophomore English Award that year because it had a specific component of classroom participation. That's her lovely stationery. And instead, she created an underground English award and gave me a copy of Eugene O'Neill's biography. And she wrote in her note to me, "Just because you choose to listen rather than speak, I did not want your brilliant work this year to go unrewarded." That gesture helped soothe the sting of knowing that my shyness had actually cost me something that I really wanted to accomplish. And the whole experience really helped me try to push myself to share more in classrooms from then on through grad school. I was really lucky throughout my time at Wellesley, from Bates all the way through Wellesley High, to have teachers who nurtured my confidence and who understood my shyness while trying to help me overcome it. They never let me doubt the power of my writing, and they didn't criticize or critique my literary sensibilities, even when they ran towards the dark, the unusual, or the melodramatic. So one thing I wanted to do tonight is read a short excerpt from my novel, which just came out, called Asylum. I thought I would read one of the more surreal, hallucinatory sections so you get a taste for the sort of writing I do. The book is focused on the relationship between two historical figures, the renowned French neurologist J.M. Charcot, who studied the phenomenon and controversial disease of hysteria at the end of his career in the 1800s, and his star patient, Augustine, who would perform her hysterical attacks in front of an audience and have these seizures during Charcot's lectures. He was one of the first doctors to present live patients on the stage. In the excerpt from the middle of the novel, Augustine has just fallen into a state of hysterical sleep. And you'll hear mention of one character named M, who is Augustine's possible imaginary lover. So I'm just going to read it. It's very short. She falls into a dormancy that lasts for days, face flushed, limbs fixed in attitudes of repose that cannot be easily altered. A relaxation that is in fact rigidity, her eyes moving beneath the lids as if absorbed in dream. But there's nothing restful about it, this semblance of sleep. He claims that he can wake her with an ovarian compression, but he does not try, wheeling her into the amphitheater instead, telling the audience how she has slept for 7 days without ceasing. And he shows them how nothing, not the noise of a drum, the inhalation of ammonia, or the electrical stimulation of the skin, muscles, nerve stems will awaken her. He increases the voltage, her reveries electrified as she is shocked into stranger and stranger states of slumber, torpor taking over, the languor of limbs. In the studio at night, which for her might as well be day, he studies her parted lips, her shallow breaths, trying to distinguish if she is dreaming of him. He tells his audience tales of somnolent women found in woods, but catching himself says, of course, these are only stories, embellished by art, of a young hysteric discovered by a youthful and scatterbrained prince. The bed against her back, the trees arched above her head. There is a tightness around her ribs, as if embracing, and she utters M, and M is not with her, off in a forest that she can only guess is around her, embowered. She whispers doctor, but he too is missing. Her eyelids stuck together as if they have been stitched shut. She's only able to lift them for seconds at a time. Images revealed to her in glimpses, her arms crossing her breasts, holding herself. Sometimes when she opens her eyes, she finds herself clasped by the arms of strangers, odd metal forearms, or the dark claws of beasts. Sometimes there are women weeping over her. In the branches, a woman marked like a witch. It frightens her how long he is willing to linger, the smell of him above her like the underside of fallen leaves. It is as if he has no other task, no duties he must fulfill. He simply waits and watches her sleep, sometimes lifting and prodding her in order to get a better view, or repositioning her stiffened limbs to feign some semblance of life. He props her against tree trunks and says her name slowly, but it tumbles out and drops like stone before it ever reaches her ears. Days pass without demarcation. In the studio, her face is unguarded, her body given over to him entirely, but at the same time, it is not. Her expression enigmatic, her skin like a screen he cannot see past. At times, he imagines that she is dreaming them all out of existence, like the princess who sent courtiers and castle into a slumber that ended only when she awoke, afraid he has become merely a fragment of her dreams. He tells the audience insistently that this is just a transformation of the classic convulsive attack, that such phenomena have occurred throughout history. But the word transformation unsettles him, makes him think of women turned into trees, or men made stags and torn apart by their own dogs, transmutations, metamorphoses, as if the body would turn itself inside out, reveal some monster hidden within, or the plush insides of skin and vein.
It was mesmerizing, Nina. Thank you. Vanessa Martir has become legendary at Wellesley High, a prodigiously talented, forthright, larger-than-life personality with a glorious laugh who listens as if it were an aerobic sport. Passion marks every ounce of her life as she enchants, challenges, and enriches those she touches. A Wellesley ABC program alum, writing is her deepest passion. Vanessa's essays have been widely published, including in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Guardian, Poets and Writers, and numerous anthologies. Vanessa is the creator of the Writing Our Lives workshop and the Writing the Mother Wound movement. Her heart genre is creative nonfiction, but she's also a novelist, poet, and playwright, as well as our social conscience, and a voice that calls out to our better selves. Vanessa.
Hello. What an introduction. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's been years since I've been in Wellesley. So thank you for putting this together and giving me the opportunity to visit this town that shaped me in so many ways. Unlike everyone here, I was not raised in Wellesley. And for you to understand my experience, I think it's important that you know where I came from. I am from Bushwick, Brooklyn. Not the Bushwick, Brooklyn of today that everyone wants to live in, because now it's like, oh my goodness, you're from Bushwick. Not from that one. I am from Bushwick when it was a pile of rubble. Between 1965 and 1980, there were over 1 million fires in New York City. If you've ever seen The Get Down, or seen documentaries like The Bronx is Burning, you see what the aftermath of that was. The South Bronx is the most infamous for the result of that. Blocks and blocks of just rubble, strewn lots, rubble, and we lived amongst that, except I lived in Bushwick, which was just as devastated. And also these burnt out buildings that they just left there. Because no one cared enough about us to do anything about it for years. Next door to the building that I grew up in was a junkyard, one of those rubble-strewn lots. And across the street, there was one of those burnt-out buildings, which in the crack era became a crack building. So that's what I left to come to Wellesley. I went to a school that was for the quote-unquote gifted and talented. And in my sophomore year, while I was really smart, I had a lot of behavioral issues. I got into a fight with a girl, and I knocked down 2 of my teachers trying to get to that girl. I am no longer that angry. I now have words. Yeah. Now these fists have a pen. And one of the professors, his name was Mr. Roth, he worked with the ABC program, and he said, what is this? What is this, Vanessa? What's all this rage? And he became my mentor. And he introduced me to the ABC program. And he told my mother, we have to get her out. She's too smart, right? And the education that she needs, she can't get it here, unfortunately. And that's how I ended up in Wellesley, the Wellesley ABC program at 12 Norfolk Terrace. We lived on the Wellesley College campus. For those who don't know, ABC is a nonprofit that gives students from the inner city who excel the opportunity to attend public and private schools across the country. That can give us the education that we can't get, unfortunately, in the cities across America, for myriad reasons, the top being racism. That's the way it is. So I was a shy 13-year-old with some behavioral issues who was pretty smart, and I came to this town, and I still remember just looking around and being like, people live like this? Like the most I saw, you see it on TV, but TV is distant, right? And I watched The Facts of Life. I don't know if you remember that. And there was a dorm, right? And I felt like I was Jo. Jo was from Brooklyn, and she was tough, and she, so that was the inspiration. I was like, I'm going to go to boarding school, and I'm going to be Jo. Except it wasn't like that, right? I really grew into my racial consciousness in this town. Within weeks of being here, I was actually walking right in front of the library. I was walking with a St. Lucian student, a junior, and I still remember his face. He was in a truck, and he's put his head out, and he spit, and he threw a lit cigarette at us. And see, he said N-word, except he used the word, go home. And this was 1989, before we really had these real big conversations around race. And as a brown person, I was a Latina, right? I still am. Back then, race was really polarized. It was black or white. So I didn't understand. And I was 13, I didn't have language, And while there were some racial issues where I was from, I came from a black and brown neighborhood, Latinx and African American, the pervasive issue was poverty. Because we were all poor and we lived in this really neglected neighborhood, right? So it was here that I grew into my racial consciousness. And honestly, I didn't fit in, right? I remember walking down the hallway with my big book bag. I always carried all my books. I don't know why. Do you remember that? I just had always a huge book bag. And hearing, talk, Rosie, talk. We want to hear you talk. Because the only context they had of Latina was Rosie Perez as Tina in Do the Right Thing. Right? And I knew it felt bad, but I didn't know that that was a microaggression because we didn't have that language. So what I did was I threw myself into literature. That's what saved me. My host parents, the Peltisons, who, yes, all these years later, right? Yes, phenomenal, fantastic people. My host dad was a professor at Wellesley College, and their house was lined with books. So I would go there once a month and just read, right? Just read. And my junior year, Brooks Goddard, I was sitting on the mezz, and he walked over, he was like, you should read this. And it was How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents. To this day, it shifted my access. Like I had never, unfortunately, again, books by black and brown people were not readily available. You might read a black writer during, Black History Month, right? But they weren't part of the curriculum. It just wasn't like that then. And for the first time, I saw myself, not just in a byline, but in characters. And these characters were like me, except I wasn't an immigrant, I was second generation. But Julia Alvarez wrote about these girls, Dominican girls, going to boarding school and navigating white America. And I was just blown away. I also remember reading The Bell Jar in your class. Also another book that just blew my mind, and reading it again and again and again. And then senior year, humanities with Miss Goddard, where I think it was one of the first times that my big mouth was appreciated, because I always had something to say, right? I always had something to say, and I always had to push back. And Jeanie, and I'll still call him Uncle Murphy. That's what everyone was like, it's Uncle Jerry. Uncle Murphy he was to me. They encouraged my big mouth and my social activism, and because I didn't understand why my people lived like that. Why did the system not care about us? And I wanted to say something about it, and they encouraged me. And that forever changed me. When I went to Columbia University, and without the education that I received in Wellesley, I never would have been able to go to Columbia University. That is just the truth. And I was part of the movement to get ethnic studies. I don't know if you remember that, 1992, we took over Hamilton Hall, we blocked Broadway. I drew the line at getting arrested. I was like, not doing that. But, the hunger strikes, we took over like buildings in the school, and we finally got it my senior year. So that was huge. But then there was also the issue at Columbia. I had a professor. It was the one creative writing class, because I was thinking about it, because I still remember the self-paper in humanities. It was the first time I wrote publicly about my life. And I didn't tell the whole truth, because I wasn't ready to tell the whole truth. But I got an A. And I remember Jeanie saying, I want to hear more. And now, of course, my heart genre is creative nonfiction, and that started in your class. It is the work that I do in the world. But I took a creative writing class at Columbia, and I remember the professor said, write about something beautiful. And so I wrote about, and I'm going to use the term, I hate the term, but it's the term that we used. I wrote about the quote unquote, the neighborhood crackhead, Teresa. Because when she was high, she was beautiful because she was happy. I remember once watching her balance herself on a fire hydrant. And she was singing and she was laughing. And it was the only time that she wouldn't cover her mouth because she wasn't ashamed of her rotting teeth. And the professor, when he gave me that paperback, first of all, he didn't have the gall to look at me when he said it. But he said, this isn't writing. And what he was telling me was what the world told me at every turn. There is nothing worthy of you or your people to write about. We don't want to hear that. So I did what was expected of me. I learned to write in this very stilted way that wasn't natural to me. So of course I didn't become a writer right away. Why would I if I wasn't encouraged? I went into corporate America and I got fired a lot because I hated the work. And I did everything from like paralegal, I worked in publishing, I worked in health management, I worked in the finance industry. I tried everything, and then in 2004, I had my daughter. And I remember thinking, I know what misery looks like. I was raised in a household that was very like full of trauma and sadness and misery. I said, I need to do something different. And I filled like 5 or 6 journals while I was pregnant. Because writing was what I did. Writing was always, literature was always my heart. And I wrote my first novel the first year, and while my daughter was, while I was nursing. And I set it up, I was in corporate America when I got pregnant. I set it up so I would get fired, because I knew I would get fired, because I was a master at getting fired, but because I could collect unemployment. It was a very strategic move. And in that first year, I wrote my first novel. And I needed to write the novel to say I was a writer out loud, because until then, I'd be like, yeah, I'm a writer. But once I did that, it was no stopping me. And I thought about Brooks Goddard and how the Garcia girls lost their accent. And I thought about Jeanie, because while I wrote a novel, it was memoir that was calling me for years. And I kept getting the pull because I'm fascinated by the human experience, right? Not just my human experience. I'm just writing about the human experience from my lens, right? And I wrote 2 novels. I have another novel, 352 pages. I'm still very much in love with the protagonist. But then just memoir took over. And in the midst of that, I found my self-paper. And I remember reading and being like, that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie. But what was true was the hunger and the longing. That was very true. And it took being in Wellesley, being away from everything that I loved, for me to really like look at myself and look at my life and say, you know, I'm gonna do this. And always doing it my way, because that was another thing that was always really encouraged. Like, do it your way. You don't have to do it. So I don't have an MFA. I have what I call a DIY MFA. I am obsessive with my study of craft. I've also attended a ton of residencies, Tin House, and very prestigious residencies, and worked with some really phenomenal writers. But the foundation is Bushwick, without a doubt. When it was a pile of rubble, my mother created a garden oasis in a war zone. And in that, because we lived on the first floor, so you climb out the window and you're in the backyard. And there was a plum tree in the backyard. And that was where I started telling myself stories, right? And also Wellesley High School, working with these phenomenal teachers. Also Miss Lynn, who I've never been able to get in contact with. So, yes, sociology, because she put that seed in me, that study of sociology and like understanding like why things are the way they are. And my host parents, without a doubt. Your love for literature, watching you, and all the books. And I just pick a book. And I learned recently that Tim would put books in my room, like maybe Vanessa like this. I had no idea. And it worked. It worked. And Tim and I got into some pretty heated conversations about Dickens, because he's a Dickens scholar, and I hated Dickens. And he tried to defend Dickens to me. But really, Wellesley High School and the experience here really laid a foundation for me that I still carry. And that self-paper, Jeanie, like it's the work I do. I'm working on a memoir. I've been working on the memoir for when you said, yes, forever. It feels like forever. But I write a lot of personal essays, and they're out in the world. And it started here and in Bushwick. So thank you for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. The fall after my sophomore year with Jeanie Eaton, Mr. Crockett hired a new English teacher, Brooks Goddard, a charming and idealistic young man just back from years teaching in Kenya with Teachers for East Africa. Mr. Crockett put him in the classroom next to Jeanie's. A year later, they were married. Both stayed at Wellesley High for their entire teaching career. For Brooks, that was 30 years, 20 of those as department chair. Brooks graduated from Williams, received a diploma in education from Uganda's Makari University, and earned a master's in language and literature from the Teachers College at Columbia. His favorite courses to teach at Wellesley were sophomore English, America, with colleague John McDermott, and The Nature of Man, English 41. With all that he has written and said over these years, my favorite quote of his is, "My 53-year love affair with my wife, Jeanie, is the glory of my life." Brooks.
Well, I've been here before. I have just two things to say. First of all, there is really nothing for me to say because it's already been said. And you have heard how the school has contributed to a sensibility that nurtured writing, directly and indirectly. To say that we're all intensely proud of the exploits of our graduates, and we know that we didn't really directly contribute to that, but we did informally contribute to that. And I think you've heard from these four speakers the ways in which that nurturing took place. And my assumption is continues to take place. I have some stuff to say, but I'm not going to say it because the time is short, and you all want to hear these two student poets, and then mad dash for the goodies before the library closes at 9 o'clock. So I did want to say that when I said I've been here before, I want you to understand that I followed a legend. And I'm married a saint. The next thing I want to say is that I'm very proud to be part of this community, and I saw it in action last Saturday night at the other venue that is central to the heart of this town, the Italo-American Club. Now, some of you probably don't know the Italo-American Club, but everybody here who's been around knows about it, and it is the place, all right? And the class of 1972 gathered. And I said to myself, this is community, all right? And I look around here, and we've all gathered, and I said, this is community. And I think we're all the richer for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooks. Since tonight we've examined the past and the present, we're ending with the future. With us are two of Wellesley High's writers of the next generation, two seniors who will each read one of their poems to end the night. To symbolize that they are carrying on the Wellesley High tradition, we're presenting to each of them a volume of Sylvia Plath's collected poems, signed by all of the authors on the panel. First, Derek Jimenez.
Closing in 10 minutes.
They won't kick us out.
Shut down automatically in 5 minutes.
I feel bad.
If you need to check out any materials, please do so now. Thank you.
Okay, after that interruption, I'm Derek, and I'm a senior at Wellesley High School, and today I will be reading a poem called To My People. I am a son. I hide in the shadows, yet when the sun comes, I fall, descend as ash, then arises my true form. Does it come as a surprise? My curls used to bounce with every step I took. My skin glows like that of a goddess. My eyes are almost as dark as my curls. Do you want to know what I learned in this form? You hate my melanin unless it's golden hour because that's Instagram worthy. You say you want my curls so bad, yet when I say the frizz is annoying, your response is, well, I don't want the frizz. You learned to hate me, but I learned to hate myself before you ever could. I am the sun. I hide in the shadows. I lie in another state, placeless, engulfed in the stars. Do you want to know what I learned? Your people live comfortably on the backs of mine. Don't speak, don't hush. It's the hardest truth to kill. You don't like the thought of love in specific forms with the justification of a god. You sent many of my people to me before their time. You treat as my people as caged birds to sit and watch you fly, but now it's their time to soar. To my people, listen to these words, use them as your wings. Let my voice act as your roots, always guiding you home. I'm here to unlock your cage because I'm the black sun, the son of a nigger, and yet when the sun comes, I shine brighter. Thank you.
Derek, that was extraordinary. Thank you for sharing that with us. And finally, to close the evening, we have Maya McNeil.
Okay, I am Maya McNeil. I am also a senior of Wellesley High School. Today's poem that I have today is called The Intentions of Poetry. Poetry isn't my hobby. Not when I'm sitting thinking about racism and the phobias and the Roe v. Wade turnover. Not when I'm sitting healing my traumas through spoken word poetry with so much delivery. Not when I'm all up in my feels, pull out the journaling and the pen hits the paper and it becomes a never-ending marathon between my pen and my hand. Me writing poetry is like listening to Erykah Badu singing her words that bring so much life, so much wisdom my third eye gets to see when I step into my artistic element. Poetry is my spiritual healer. It's like I'm self-reflecting in the third person most times, like I'm opening portals of energy because the words flow. So, likely, poetry is my healer, healing to me, healing to you. To let you know, stop letting everyone into your space before you break. And so, let me feed your soul with the nutrients of poetry. When you feel like pulling away, you say you can't get a hold of me. So to poetry, your mirrored reflection of my embodied individuality, everything I think, you say. So everything I praise, you say with so much light and so much wisdom. So when I see someone new, I want to gift them with words of poetry. Thank you.
Wow, Maya, you and Derek are the future of poetry, and we're so proud to have been here at your beginning. So thank all of you for sharing in this evening. It's just been extraordinary, and we're proud to have you all together. Thank you all, and there's lots of wonderful yummies left over, so everybody take a plate home.
And buy some books.